One impulsive hug. One powerful stranger. One missing brother who holds the key to everything she thought she knew. Was it fate or just a cruel twist of coincidence? Watch how loss, hope, and an unexpected bond change Bella Freed's life forever, starting with a single moment in a mountain marketplace that neither of them will ever forget. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The cold mountain air bit at Bella's cheeks as she stepped off the bus, her worn boots crunching on the frozen gravel of the village road. Snow clung stubbornly to the pine-covered slopes, and the quiet seemed almost too deep, as if the whole world were holding its breath. She stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the cluster of wooden houses, smoke curling from chimneys, the marketplace ahead where bright fabrics and dried herbs hung like promises of life in the dead of winter. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her old canvas bag, the weight of exhaustion and worry pressing down harder than the bitter wind. Nate had to be here. Somewhere among these faces, these streets. The last email from him, weeks ago now, had mentioned this place. He'd written about a market where he found herbs for local remedies, about a village tucked against the mountainside. And then, nothing. Silence that echoed too loud in her sleepless nights. She moved forward, drawn toward the market square as if by instinct. People bustled between the stalls, bartering, laughing, their voices rising in clouds of breath. The scent of smoke, pine, and dried lavender filled the air. Her eyes scanned every face, hope flickering each time she glimpsed a tall figure, dark hair, broad shoulders. Her heart ached with the weight of it. How many times had she imagined this moment? And then she saw him. Tall, with a rugged build, wrapped in a heavy coat dusted with snow. Dark hair curled past his collar, and a beard framed his face, just as Nate's had in the last photo she'd received. His back was to her as he leaned over a stall piled high with baskets of roots and herbs. Her breath caught. "Nate," she whispered, the words snatched away by the wind. Without thinking, driven by relief, longing, and the ache of too many lonely days, Bella broke into a run. She didn't see the startled looks from passers-by, didn't feel the cold. All she saw was him. She closed the distance, reached out, and wrapped her arms around him from behind, clinging as if to anchor herself in this moment. "I found you," she breathed against his coat. "Thank God, I found you." The man froze. His shoulders tensed beneath her hands. Slowly, he turned, and Bella stepped back, heart slamming against her ribs as she lifted her gaze to meet his. It wasn't Nate. The eyes that met hers were the wrong shade of blue, piercing, yes, but sharper, cooler. His expression was a mix of surprise and something she couldn't name. His beard was thicker, his hair longer than Nate's had ever been, and now, up close, she could see the lines of strain around his mouth, the faint scar near his temple. I'm so sorry," she stammered, cheeks flaming with humiliation. I thought you were someone else." The man blinked, then, unexpectedly, his mouth curved into the faintest of smiles. "Well," he said, voice low, rich with the kind of warmth that came from someone who hadn't laughed in a long time, "that's the most memorable greeting I've had at this market." Bella's face burned hotter. "I didn't mean I wasn't. I'm just looking for my brother." He studied her, his gaze steady, not unkind. "And you thought I was him?" She nodded, unable to meet his eyes now. "You look a lot like him. From behind. And it's been so long. Her voice broke, and she bit her lip hard, forcing back the sudden sting of tears. For a moment, the man said nothing. Then he stepped back slightly, giving her space, as if understanding she needed it. "I'm Mark," he offered quietly. "Mark Benson." The name didn't register at first. Bella was too busy trying to steady her breathing to will her heart to stop racing. Then it clicked. Benson. As in the Mark Benson? The recluse millionaire? The man who, according to rumors she'd read in the news, had vanished into the wilderness after walking away from a life of power and wealth? "I'm Bella," she said finally, voice small. "Bella Freed." A beat of silence stretched between them, filled only by the sounds of the market and the whistle of the wind through the pines. Then Mark's gaze softened as if something about her name, or the desperation in her eyes, stirred something in him. "Your brother," he said slowly. "What's his name?" Nate Freed. He worked here. At the clinic. He's been missing for weeks. I came to find him. Mark's expression changed almost imperceptibly, but enough that Bella saw it. The quiet understanding in his eyes deepened, shaded now with concern. I knew Nate, he said. He helped me more than once. We spoke often. I didn't know he was missing. Bella swallowed hard. The tears she'd been holding back threatened again. Do you know anything? Anything at all? Mark hesitated, then nodded toward the edge of the market. Let's get out of the cold. I'll tell you what I know. Together they stepped away from the bustle of the stalls toward a quieter street where the snow crunched underfoot and the world felt smaller, more intimate. Bella's heart still raced, but now it was from the flood of questions, the fragile thread of hope she clung to, and the strange, unshakable feeling that this man, this stranger she'd mistaken for her brother, was about to change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The cafe Mark led her to was small, tucked between two stone buildings, with frost edging the windows and the soft glow of lanterns spilling warmth onto the snow. Inside, it smelled of strong coffee and wood smoke, and the hush of the place felt like a balm to Bella's frayed nerves. They took a corner table and Mark ordered tea for both of them without asking, as if sensing she needed something hot to hold on to. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken questions thick between them. Bella stared down at the worn wood of the table, tracing a crack with her fingertip, gathering the courage to look at him again. When she did, she found his gaze already on her, steady, thoughtful, but not invasive. He looked like a man used to reading others, but unused to being read himself. I should explain, Mark said, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the soft clatter of cups behind the counter. About Nate. Her heart lurched. You know where he is? His expression shifted, regret darkening his eyes. No, but I know some of what happened. The night he disappeared, a storm came in fast. He'd gone to help a group of hikers who got trapped up near the ridge. I only heard later that he didn't come back with the others. Bella's breath caught. So there's a search? There is. I've made sure of it. His jaw tightened slightly. The official teams did what they could, but the conditions were bad and they had to stop after a few days. I hired private crews. They're still out there. We're not giving up. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. Relief mingled with fresh waves of fear, but also something else, gratitude, unexpected and fierce. Why? Why would you do that for him? Mark's gaze held hers, unwavering. Because he helped me when I didn't think anyone would. Because I owe him. And maybe because it's the right thing to do. The tea arrived, steam curling between them, a fragile thread of warmth. Bella wrapped her hands around the mug, letting it ground her. She felt as if she were standing at the edge of something she didn't yet understand but couldn't walk away from. I want to help, she said quietly. I'm not leaving until I find him. Mark nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. You can. You will. But not out there. It's dangerous terrain and you don't know it. What you can do is help us from here. We're using drones, heat mapping, satellite data. Someone with your skills could be exactly what we need. Her eyes widened. You know I guessed. The way you talk. The way you look at problems. You're not just here as his sister. Bella felt a flicker of surprise, but also respect. He saw more than most. I work in cybersecurity. Data analysis. I can handle search software, mapping, patterns. Good. Mark's mouth curved in what almost passed for a smile. You'll work with me. We'll coordinate with the team. And we'll find him. The way he said it, steady, certain as if failure wasn't an option, sent a strange comfort through her. For the first time in weeks, Bella felt less alone. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Okay. Tell me what I need to do. Over the next hour, Mark sketched out the efforts already underway. Search grids, drone footage, sensor readings. Bella listened, asked sharp questions, suggested ways to refine the data, and saw the faintest spark of approval in his eyes each time she found a new angle. The tension between them eased as they talked, not gone, but shifting into something more collaborative, more human. When they stepped back out into the cold, the daylight had begun to fade, the mountains throwing long shadows across the village. The air smelled of snow. Mark glanced at her, and for a heartbeat, the silence between them felt charged with something unspoken, something that had started the moment she'd thrown her arms around him and called him by another name. "We'll start tonight," he said finally. "I'll send you what we have. You'll have access to everything." "Thank you," she said, meaning it. Not just for the data, but for the way he'd let her in. For the way his quiet strength made her believe they might really bring Nate home. He hesitated, then gave a brief nod as if acknowledging the weight of what passed between them. "See you soon, Bella." As she watched him walk away, his coat dark against the snow, Bella felt a strange pull toward the man who wasn't her brother, but who had, in a single afternoon, become a part of this fight. And maybe, just maybe, a part of something she hadn't known she was missing. Night came fast in the mountains. By the time Bella reached the small room she'd rented above the village store, the world outside had gone dark, and the only light came from the soft glow of a single lamp and the scatter of stars beyond the frosted window. She dropped her bag by the bed and sank into the creaking chair at the small desk, fingers trembling with fatigue and purpose. True to his word, Mark had sent her everything. Drone footage, heat maps, reports from the search team, even weather data for the nights since Nate had gone missing. The files filled her laptop screen, lines of numbers, grids of color, blurry images of ridges and snowfields that made her heart ache. Somewhere in the sea of data had to be a clue. She wouldn't believe otherwise. She worked through the night, eyes burning, mind sharp despite the exhaustion. Patterns, probabilities, anomalies, this was her world, the one place where she felt control. She marked coordinates where sensor pings didn't match animal movement. She overlaid storm paths with the likely route Nate would have taken. The deeper she went, the more the fear loosened its grip, replaced by focus, by determination. A soft knock at the door startled her. She froze, then stood, crossing to open it a crack. Mark stood there, framed in the dim hallway light, snow melting on his shoulders. His expression was careful, but his eyes, those clear, sharp eyes, held something like concern. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to wake you. I just wanted to check if you were okay. I saw your light." Bella hesitated, then opened the door wider. "I couldn't sleep. Too much to do." He glanced past her at the screen, at the maps and grids, and nodded once. "I thought you might say that." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward now, but full of something else, understanding, maybe. A sense of being on the same side. "You should rest," Mark said finally. "You'll think clearer tomorrow." "So should you," she countered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But here you are." His mouth quirked. "Touché." The faintest warmth spread through the chill in the room. Without really meaning to, Bella stepped back, gesturing toward the chair near the window. "If you want, we could go over the grids together." "Two heads, right?" Mark hesitated, then stepped inside, shaking off his coat and settling into the chair. The room felt smaller with him in it, but not in a bad way. More like it finally fit the shape of what tonight had become, a shared vigil. They worked side by side, voices low, eyes flicking between the screen and each other. Mark caught details she'd missed, paths where the snow looked disturbed, the shape of a shelter someone might have built. Bella pointed out inconsistencies in the heat signatures, recalibrated the overlays. Slowly, their initial tension gave way to a rhythm, a kind of partnership neither had expected. Sometime near dawn, Bella sat back, rubbing her eyes. Mark watched her, the ghost of a smile softening his usually guarded features. "You're good at this," he said quietly. She huffed a laugh. "I have to be. It's the only way I know how to fight for him." Mark's gaze held hers. "You're not fighting alone." The words hit deeper than she expected. Maybe it was the sleepless night or the raw edges of fear and hope rubbing against each other. Maybe it was the way he said it, not as a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but as a truth he'd already chosen. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it more than she could say. They stayed that way, the first light of dawn bleeding into the sky, the village still asleep around them. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting, like them, for whatever came next. The morning brought no miracles, no messages from the search team, no sudden clues, but it brought resolve. The snow had eased by sunrise, leaving the village wrapped in a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. Bella stepped out into the cold, the weight of a sleepless night in her bones, but clarity in her mind. Mark walked beside her, their strides falling into an unspoken sync as they crossed the square to the search post, a small building that had become the command center for the operation. Inside, maps covered the walls, dotted with pins and notes in different hands. A radio crackled softly in the corner, voices from the mountain teams checking in. Mark spoke with the leader of the private crew he'd hired, his tone low but firm, the kind of voice that made people listen. Bella watched him as she set up her laptop at a makeshift desk. There was something about him in these moments, focused, capable, a man used to carrying the weight of others' hopes. When he returned to her side, she looked up from the maps she was reviewing. "They're still searching?" "Every hour they can," he said. "We've narrowed the grid. Your data helped." The quiet pride in his voice startled her, warmed her. She wasn't used to being seen this way, not just as the anxious sister, but as someone contributing, making a difference. "I think I can do more," she said, gesturing to the screen. "If we recalibrate the thermal overlays with the storm's timeline, we might spot heat traces that didn't match up before. It's tedious, but..." Mark smiled, not with amusement, but with respect. "Do it. I'll handle things here. We'll get food later." They worked through the morning, and though the worry for Nate gnawed at her, Bella felt a strange sense of purpose, as if the storm inside her had found direction. Every so often, she felt Mark's gaze on her, steady and grounding, and she realized how much that steadiness mattered. How much he mattered. By midday, the village square had grown busier. Supplies arrived for the teams, volunteers came and went. Mark was called out to oversee a delivery. Bella stayed behind, hunched over her laptop, fingers flying over keys, cross-referencing data. She barely noticed the world outside until a soft knock made her glance up. It was one of the search crew members, a woman with a lined face and kind eyes. "You should take a break," she said gently. "Mark said to remind you." Bella blinked, realizing how long she'd been at it. She nodded, saving her work. As she stepped outside, the cold slapped her cheeks, but it felt good, bracing, real. She found Mark near the edge of the square, speaking with a group of villagers who'd offered to help. When he spotted her, his expression eased. "You should eat something," he said as she approached. "I'm fine," she started. But he raised an eyebrow, and she relented. "Okay, maybe a little." They shared a simple meal at a bench, a thermos of hot broth, bread from the village baker. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast after the long hours of tension. The quiet between them wasn't awkward now. It felt like its own kind of language, one neither of them had to work at. "Thank you," she said after a while, surprising herself with the words. "Not just for Nate, for everything. Letting me in. Letting me help." Mark looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You don't need to thank me for that. You belong in this." The words lodged somewhere deep, where the loneliness had lived too long. She nodded, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. The afternoon wore on. Together, they reviewed new footage as it came in, updated search maps, recalibrated plans. And as night began to fall again, Bella realized that what scared her most wasn't the mountain, or the cold, or even the uncertainty of finding Nate. It was how easily Mark had become her anchor in all of this, how much she already trusted him. And somewhere beneath that fear, something else stirred. A fragile hope, a feeling she hadn't dared to name. Night brought with it another storm. The snow came harder this time, driven sideways by a biting wind that rattled shutters and howled through the narrow streets. The search teams had to pull back, forced to wait until the weather eased. Inside the command post, the tension was palpable. Radio updates turned into silence. Maps were pored over again and again, as if staring at them harder might change the answers they gave. Bella sat at her station, eyes fixed on her screen, jaw tight. She felt the helplessness creeping in, the gnawing frustration of being trapped behind data while Nate was still out there. She wanted to do more, to be more, but all she had were algorithms, grids, and faith. Mark stood by the window watching the storm. His shoulders were set, his posture tense, but his expression was unreadable. She wondered what ghosts haunted him in nights like this, what memories stirred beneath the surface of that controlled calm. Finally, she couldn't stand the quiet. "We're losing time," she said, sharper than she meant to. "Every hour out there." "I know." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a rawness she hadn't heard before. "You think I don't feel it? That I'm not out of my mind wanting to be up there myself?" The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Bella blinked, taken aback. Not at his frustration, but at the glimpse of the man beneath the surface. The man who wasn't just holding the line for her, but fighting his own battle. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean." Mark shook his head, his gaze dropping. "No, don't be. You're right. We are losing time. And I hate it." The storm raged outside, as if echoing their shared helplessness. After a moment, Mark moved away from the window, dragging a chair beside hers. He sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tight. "When I came here," he said quietly, "I thought I could leave the world behind, the noise, the people, the weight of it all. But I couldn't, because the weight was me. It followed me here." Bella turned to look at him, the vulnerability in his voice more striking than anything else he'd said. "And Nate, he didn't care who I was, or what I was running from. He just helped. No questions, no judgment. I owe him. I owe you." She hesitated, then reached out, resting her hand lightly over his clenched fists. His hands were cold, the tension in them sharp as stone. But after a moment, they loosened, his fingers turning to lace briefly with hers. "We'll find him," she whispered. "We have to." Mark looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing past the weariness and the fear to the heart of who she was. And in that moment, the storm outside felt distant, the only thing that mattered the connection between them. Fragile, unexpected, but real. Hours passed. They worked side by side, trying to outthink the mountain, to find new angles, new possibilities. And when the storm finally broke just before dawn, it felt like a promise that the fight wasn't over, that hope still lived. Mark straightened, scrubbing a hand over his face. "We'll get them back out there as soon as it's safe. And you try to rest." Bella shook her head. "Not yet. There's more I can do." His smile was faint but full of something warmer than before. "Stubborn." She smiled back, the first real one in days. "You're just figuring that out?" Mark chuckled softly, and for the first time since this began, the sound felt easy, natural. They weren't just two people bound by circumstance anymore. They were partners in this fight, and maybe something more, something that neither of them dared name just yet, but both felt all the same. The morning after the storm felt like a new beginning, though the sky remained heavy with low clouds. The search teams moved out again at first light, armed with updated maps and recalibrated coordinates. Bella had spent the last hours cross-referencing thermal readings with the storm's path, and for the first time something felt different. a subtle anomaly in the data that didn't match any of the animal patterns she'd studied since arriving. Mark stood behind her, silent but attentive as she pointed at the screen. "Here," she said, zooming in on a narrow ravine between two ridges. This heat trace showed up right before the storm hit. It stayed consistent through the worst of it, then faded just after. That could be a shelter or a person. His eyes narrowed, sharp and focused. No one's searched that sector yet. The storm cut it off before. Bella nodded, heart beating faster. Then that's where they should look. Without wasting time, Mark relayed the coordinates to the team leader, his voice calm but urgent over the radio. Then he turned back to her, something fierce in his gaze. "Good work. That's exactly what we needed." The words sent a warmth through her she didn't expect, and not just from the praise. It was the way he said it, as if they truly were a team, as if he trusted her instincts as much as his own. The hours that followed were tense, filled with waiting and updates crackling through the radio, interspersed with static. Bella tried to keep working, refining the grid, watching for new patterns, but part of her attention remained tethered to Mark. There was a steadiness to him now that calmed her, the quiet strength of someone who'd carried burdens heavier than this and survived. In a rare moment of quiet, she glanced at him. "Why did you really come here?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Mark didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting to the window, where snowflakes began to fall again, softer this time. "Because I thought I could disappear," he said at last, his voice low. "I thought if I went far enough, high enough, I could outrun the ghosts. But it doesn't work that way." His honesty surprised her. She expected deflection, maybe a joke. But he gave her truth instead. "You don't seem like a man who runs," she said gently. A faint smile touched his lips, bittersweet. "You'd be surprised." Bella hesitated, then reached out, resting her hand on his forearm. "You're not running now." Mark looked at her, and for a moment, the guardedness dropped. There was gratitude in his eyes, and something deeper, something that made her chest tighten. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not." The radio crackled, drawing their attention. A voice came through, strained but clear. They'd reached the sector. They were checking the ravine. Bella held her breath, heart hammering. Mark moved closer, as if by standing together, they could will the news they needed into being. Minutes felt like hours as the radio hissed with static, then came alive again. A voice, breathless with cold and exertion. "We found signs. Someone was here. A makeshift shelter. No body, no gear. Could have moved on." Hope and dread collided in Bella's chest. "It means he was alive during the storm," she whispered. Mark nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving the radio. "And we're closer now." They spent the rest of the day refining the next phase of the search. The tension between them threaded now with determination and something gentler, shared glances that lingered a moment too long, small touches that spoke of comfort more than necessity. When evening came and the search teams returned to rest and regroup, Bella found herself standing beside Mark outside the command post, the night cold and clear. "Thank you," she said, not for the first time. Mark shook his head. "Don't. Not until we bring him home." She hesitated, then smiled softly. "Then I'll save it." He smiled back, and for a heartbeat, the world felt quiet, not because the fight was over, but because in that moment, neither of them felt alone. The cold that night was the kind that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. But neither Bella nor Mark noticed it much. They stood outside the command post long after the rest of the team had turned in, their breath misting the air, their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the edge of the village where the mountains loomed. "There's a chance, isn't there?" Bella asked, voice barely more than a whisper. "If he built that shelter, if he moved on." Mark nodded slowly. "There's always a chance. And we'll follow every one of them." She looked at him then, really looked, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the set of his shoulders, the strength that hadn't wavered even after days of worry and endless decisions. "You don't give up," she said quietly. "Neither do you," he replied. His gaze held hers, and the connection between them felt as solid as the ground beneath their feet. In the early hours, they gathered again with the team, planning the next push. Bella refined the data overnight, and the search grid was tighter now, focused on the most promising paths leading away from the shelter site. As the teams moved out at dawn, Bella and Mark watched from the edge of the square, the crunch of boots on snow the only sound as the searchers disappeared into the pale light. They returned to their makeshift command post, but the waiting was harder now. Every radio check-in, every burst of static felt like it might be the moment everything changed. And then, just after noon, a voice came through that sent Bella's heart racing. "We found tracks. Fresh, maybe a day old. Heading toward the South Ridge." Mark snapped to attention, his hand tightening around the radio. "Follow them. Stay in contact." Bella felt a surge of hope so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. Mark turned to her, and without thinking, she reached for him, her fingers brushing his sleeve. He didn't pull away. Instead, he covered her hand with his, grounding her as the emotion swept through. The hours that followed were a blur of reports, recalculations, and anxious waiting. Bella and Mark worked side by side, refining routes, sending suggestions to the field teams. The tension was thick, but beneath it was something else now, a unity, trust, a bond forged in these impossible days. By evening, the team leader called in again. The tracks had led to a narrow pass, treacherous and slow to navigate. They'd have to wait for morning light to push through it safely. Disappointment rippled through the room, but Mark steadied them all. "We're close," he said, his voice low but sure. "Tomorrow we'll find him." That night, Bella couldn't bring herself to return to her room. She stayed in the command post, reviewing data, listening for updates. Mark stayed too, neither of them willing to let the other keep vigil alone. They talked in low voices about small things, music, food they missed, memories of cities far from these mountains. Somewhere in the middle of it, Bella realized she was no longer afraid of the silence between them. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they didn't have to say. In the quietest hour of the night, when the village was still and the stars burned bright above the peaks, Mark spoke softly. "When this is over, when we find him, you should know something. I came here to disappear. But meeting you, I don't want to be invisible anymore." Bella's breath caught. She turned to him, heart full of too many things to name. And in that moment, she reached out, not thinking, just feeling, and rested her hand against his cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into the touch as if he'd been waiting for it all along. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. The storm between them had finally quieted, at least for now. Morning came cold and sharp, the kind of cold that burned your lungs with each breath. But the promise in the air was stronger than the frost. The search team set out at first light, climbing toward the narrow pass where the tracks had led. Bella and Mark stood together at the edge of the square, watching as the team disappeared into the pale gold of dawn. "This is it," Mark said quietly. His voice was steady, but she heard the tension beneath, the fierce hope he kept so tightly contained. Bella nodded, her heart pounding. "This is it." They returned to the command post, but waiting felt unbearable now. Every minute dragged, each radio crackle like the beat of a drum too slow to bear. Bella tried to keep working, checking maps, cross-referencing grids, but her hands shook with the weight of it all. Mark stayed close, his presence a constant reassurance. He didn't speak much, but when he did, It was to remind her they were doing everything they could, that this wasn't over. Not yet. His calm helped more than she could say, and the way he looked at her, steady, certain, made her believe they could endure this moment, however long it lasted. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the village. Then, just as Bella thought she might break from the waiting, the radio crackled to life. "We found him. We've got him. Alive." The words hit like a thunderclap. Bella gasped, tears spilling over before she could stop them. Mark caught her as her knees gave way for just a second, his arms strong and sure around her. "He's alive," she kept repeating, hardly able to believe it. "He's alive." Mark held her until she steadied, then stepped back, his smile breaking through the guarded calm at last, wide and real. "Told you, we don't give up." The team worked to bring Nate down from the mountain, moving carefully, but faster now that relief fueled their steps. Bella and Mark met them at the edge of the village as the first figures came into view. Nate looked pale, thinner than she remembered, but his smile when he saw her was enough to make her heart ache with joy. "Liv," he said, voice hoarse but warm. "You didn't have to come all this way." She laughed through her tears, pulling him into a careful hug. "Of course I did. What did you expect?" Mark stood back, watching, giving them space, but when Nate's gaze found him, something unspoken passed between the two men. Gratitude, respect, a bond forged in the silent promise of survival. As the team led Nate toward the clinic, Bella turned to Mark. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes, the way she reached for his hand, it said everything. "Thank you for not letting her break, for not letting her face this alone." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Go with him," he said. "I'll check on the others." But later, when the village had quieted, when Nate was safe and resting, Bella found Mark outside, standing at the edge of the square where it all began. The night was clear again, the stars bright above the peaks. She stepped up beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "You didn't disappear," she said softly. "Not to me." Mark looked at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight, and for the first time, he let his guard fall completely. "And you didn't let me." In the quiet that followed, they stood together, the weight of the days behind them giving way to something new, something full of hope. The days that followed felt like the slow release of a breath neither of them had known they'd been holding. Nate recovered steadily, gaining strength with each passing sunrise. The village seemed to exhale along with them, the tension of the search replaced by quiet relief. Snow still dusted the rooftops, but the storm inside Bella had begun to clear. She spent long hours with Nate, catching up on all the words they'd both left unspoken during the weeks apart. But even as she sat at his bedside, part of her heart remained tethered to the man who had stood beside her through the storm, who had become her anchor in ways she hadn't expected. Mark kept his distance at first, not out of coldness, but out of respect, as if sensing she and Nate needed space to find their footing again. But his quiet presence was never far, fresh supplies left at the door, check-ins with the medical team, the brief but steady looks they shared whenever their paths crossed in the village square. When Nate was strong enough to walk through the village with her, he watched her more than the scenery, a thoughtful expression on his face. At last, he spoke the words that had been waiting on both their tongues. "He matters to you," Nate said simply, nodding toward Mark, who stood talking with one of the search team leaders near the edge of the square. Bella didn't answer right away. She watched Mark, the way his posture had eased, how his smile, though small, had become more real since the day they brought Nate home. "He does," she admitted softly. I didn't mean for it to happen. But it did. Nate smiled gently. Good. You deserve someone who stands beside you like that. The days turned into a week, and with Nate's recovery well on its way, Bella knew the time was coming to decide what came next. The night before she and Nate planned to leave for the city, she found herself once more at the edge of the square, drawn to the same spot where so much had begun. Mark was there, as she'd known he would be, his gaze on the mountains that had given him both refuge and reckoning. She stood beside him, silent for a moment, before speaking. We're leaving tomorrow. I know, Mark said quietly. His voice was steady, but she heard the ache beneath it. She looked up at him, searching his face, and found the same strength, the same gentleness that had carried her through those dark days. I don't want this to be goodbye. Mark turned to her fully then, his eyes dark and full of everything he hadn't let himself say. It doesn't have to be. Bella's breath hitched. I don't know what comes next. I just know I want you in it. His smile was soft, sure. Then we'll figure it out. One step at a time. And as the stars burned bright above them, as the village slept and the mountains stood witness, Bella stepped into his arms, not by mistake this time, not driven by desperation or fear, but by choice. His embrace was warm, steady, everything she hadn't known she'd been seeking. When they parted, there was no grand promise, no dramatic vow, just the quiet certainty of two people who had found something real in the most unexpected of places. And as dawn touched the peaks with gold, they stood hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next.